right. Well, as I said, we're at Skene Memorial Library in Fleischmanns, New York today. We have a wonderful talk on the role of women in 19th century baseball. My name is Colin Stumpy Miller. I represent the Fleischmanns Mountain Athletic Club. We're a vintage baseball team playing by the rules and the customs of 19th century. And we have a very special guest today with us, a true heavy hitter in the world of baseball research, a historian, a consultant to the Hall of Fame and Major League Baseball. I think she's just coming off a trip down to Rickwood Field in Birmingham, Alabama, for those who were able to tune in the other night for that wonderful game. She's also been recently involved with the Souls of the Game, the new exhibit at the Baseball Hall of Fame on Black baseball, as well as all the, she's probably the most prominent, among the most prominent researchers and historians on Negro League baseball, as well as women's baseball. And she is also the board president of the International Women's Baseball Center in Rockford, Illinois. And I put in the chat the link to the iwbc.org, where you can just log on there and make a donation in honor of her participation, as well as women in baseball. And I'm just delighted. She also happens to be a Livingston Manor native, which to those folks out in Zoom land may not make any significance, but here in the Catskill region, that's about 30 miles, I guess, as the crow flies from where we sit today in Fleischmanns. Lastly, Dr. Heaphy is also the winner of the prestigious, is it the Bob Davids Award? Yeah, so the Bob Davids Award, which is the highest honor bestowed upon a researcher within the Society for American Baseball Research. And we have a kindred spirit, another Bob Davids Award winner, John Thorne, official historian of Major League Baseball, who also has a soft spot in his heart and has written extensively about Fleischmanns and our baseball history here. So it's really a super pleasure to have Dr. Heaphy joining us today. And we, in the audience, although she can't see us, we do have a number of baseball players who have come up here from Central New Jersey to play us today at the MAC grounds at Fleischmanns Park, and they are in audience, as well as our town historian, our village historian, and some of my family. And I'm just delighted to have you here, Leslie. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to take my screen off of here and mute myself, and then we'll get to questions afterwards. Okay.
Absolutely. You can hear me just fine.
Everybody can hear you. Okay. Yep.
Awesome.
Good to go.
All right. Well, thank you, Colin, and thanks everybody else as well. I really appreciate. I wish I could be there in person, but as Colin said, I just got back from Rickwood last night, so it was a little difficult to try to make all of this work. So this is the best way that we could get this to happen. But it's always a fun opportunity to talk about women's baseball, and I'm going to focus today on the 19th century, so the 1860s to just around the turn of the century. And it is important to think about that time frame. And so to kind of set up our thought process is to remember that we're talking about in the 19th century. Very much important to think about how women were viewed and how society viewed particularly any kind of physical activity by women was generally not something that was hugely supported, and that's going to be a recurring theme as we talk through. It makes it difficult for many of the women to get any kind of support, to be taken seriously at times. And so we get these sort of two kinds of conflicting images of women ball players in the 19th century. The sort of novelty vaudevillian kind of an approach that this is not serious, right? They're not serious, we can't take them seriously. And then on the other hand, we do have women who are going to take the game very seriously, wanting to learn, wanting to promote and participate in what became America's national pastime. And so a lot of this starts often with this picture, which many of you may recognize, which is the Vassar Resolutes. A lot of times when we think about the beginnings of women's baseball in a serious fashion in the 19th century, forget about just those who are just playing just for fun, those kinds of things, just because the game is out there. We look at women's college teams, and the Vassar Resolutes were one of a number of teams at Vassar Women's College in the 1860s, 1870s, who started playing, and they played against themselves. And so what you'd have, think about today, it'd be like the sophomores playing the seniors and the freshmen playing the juniors. So they had teams like the Resolutes, the Laurels, the Abenakis. These were all girls' teams, women's teams, where they played intra-squad within the college themselves. Gradually, that's going to grow, and they will start to play other colleges as well, because that's how the game will initially spread for women. Is a lot of it's being played at places like Mills College, at Mount Holyoke, Smith, because in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, we start to see the growth of women's colleges. And then the push from some, at least, that there needed to be some kind of exercise for women. Now, baseball wasn't necessarily the one that many thought that this is what you would expect and that this is the game you want to promote. And so teams like the Resolutes were up against not only attitudes of society, attitudes of their parents in many cases, who some of these schools received complaints from the parents that eventually shut down some of the baseball teams because they didn't think this was very ladylike. This was not what they wanted their daughters to be doing. In the case of the Resolutes, we've got letters from Annie Glidden, who was one of the captains on one of the teams, to her brother, talking about, and him sort of laughing at this idea that the girls were going to play. The teams don't get a lot of publicity, limited photographs, as you can see, and this becomes the other sort of recurring theme when you're looking at women's baseball at any time period, but particularly the 19th century, and trying to figure out who exactly were these women, what was the level of play. Newspapers tended to focus more on their attire than their playing, or treating them as this novelty kind of idea. But the Resolutes in the 1860, 1870 timeframe, as I say, is sort of where a lot of this begins. And you can again see one of the difficulties of women's baseball just from this picture, when you can see the attire. And so not surprisingly, you'll read articles talking about them tripping over their long skirts, having difficulty because their shoes are not made for the physical activity that they're involved in, that kind of thing. And so this certainly, and this will remain a difficulty into the 1890s until we start to see, as you'll see from some of the later pictures, some of the bloomer teams that start to develop. Okay. And so here's an interesting picture that I just wanted to show when we're talking about the different ways women's baseball was viewed. And you can see it best in the woman that is batting, and then you can see some of the other fielders. Obviously, this would have been one of the visions that people had, that women, how could you take this seriously when they're all dressed up, when they are clearly not in an attire that you would expect. But you'll also notice they are playing with the men, which was a very typical. Oftentimes, a lot of these women's teams were going to have men on the same team with them. But this is the kind of play you would have seen a lot of, where there are picnics, things like that, and women are participating in the game just as anybody else would. And so I always say, when we look at baseball today, we get this idea that women are coming to the game or coming back to the game, but they've always played and they've always been involved and always been interested. And a picture like this, I think, helps illustrate that idea. And so here is an article, a couple of articles, just clips from it that I wanted to show you, sort of to get a sense of the kind of newspaper reportage that was common. So this one says, early July 1879, a game between the New York Red Stockings and the Philadelphia Blue Stockings. So in addition to the college teams, when we're talking about 1870s and early 1880s, we tended to see women's teams being referred to as the Red Stockings and Blue Stockings. Obviously, you can tell why, or the Blondes and the Brunettes. And that was their simple name. And so, again, you can imagine the difficulty in trying to track down. But notice the focus being very much on their attire, what they looked like. And so here's this one for the Philadelphia and the New York team says, the women worked very hard to gain famous athletes, but failed miserably. They muffed terribly and batted in a very weak manner, so much so as to satisfy the crowd that women will never become baseball players. Reporter of a rival paper came away with the same conclusion about that game. The match was a farce. Not the least baseball talent have the women. Every fly was muffed, and it was only by chance that a player was put out. So this was the kind of coverage that you tended to see more than anything else. A focus on how ridiculous it was. We're not going to promote this. These women shouldn't be playing. Why are we coming out to watch them? And so, and of course, that fit with a lot of the attitudes towards women and exercise from in many cases. So good examples. Here's an article that I think is interesting. So that first one's 1879. This one is 1898 from the Rockford Republic. And notice the headline talking immediately about their attire. It talks about the shirtwaist dresses. But then it says, and played ball like professionals. Did the lady baseball players. And it says a loud crowd entertained at Riverside Park. And this article is about two teams. They simply called them the Stars and Stripes. It says the ladies' baseball game Saturday was just splendid. It was just too delightfully lovely for anything, and every girl in the grandstand and us girl reporters wished that we could have been in it when we saw what it was and how fun it was, sorry. The Stripes and Stars were taken to the grounds in two buses. The girls alighted at the clubhouse and formed a line for the march to the benches. They made a picture pretty enough to frame. The Stars were satired in blue shirtwaists, white yachting caps with a blue star on top, and bicycle skirts. And they wore blue. The Stripes wore white shirtwaists, white caps with a red stripe around them, and had on red sashes. At either end of the advancing line was a little colored girl dressed all in white and led by the captains of the teams. And so here again is, we're almost 20 years later, and still the focus is almost entirely through this article, right? About their attire, what they're wearing, the red and the blue. And it isn't until the second column when you get, in the last inning, Mrs. Talcott hit the ball so hard that she had time to go clear around. She was cheered, and then she wouldn't even take off her hat. So even there, and then they say that she wouldn't take off her hat. None of the players would take off their hats because they didn't have a mirror, so they couldn't put them back on straight, right? So even here, and then it says the ladies were all tired out at the end of the fifth inning, and so the crowd let them stop. They got into their buses and came downtown. And so the game ended at 5 innings, and it says the score at the end was something like this, 19-6. So we're not even sure if that is the actual score of the game. We only get a couple of names. I notice it's Mrs. Talcott. There's no first name, anything like that. So we're not entirely sure who she is. And so there's that recurring theme of trying to figure out who some of these ball players are, right, as we think about this idea. This was a picture that came up fairly commonly in the newspaper, where you essentially have a drawing of a women's team. And you can see here the shift and starting to shift away from the long skirts to the bloomers, trying to make this a little more serious in an approach. You can see the wide array of fans that are present, though most of them not visible. You've got a few in the forefront gentlemen that are there to watch, probably with some betting going on, as would have been common. And so these were some of the teams you would have seen that were playing outside of those college circles I was talking about a little bit earlier. And again, but even here, notice in this drawing, you've got them wearing bloomers, but look at the shoes that they're wearing, the high belted boots that they wore that would not have been conducive for any kind of physical activity. And so again, this is what many of the women were forced. Well, and think about it later. If you think about the All-American Girls Professional League, or which I'm sure most of you are very familiar with, right? But think about the uniforms. Think about the emphasis placed upon what they were wearing in order to emphasize that these are women playing baseball. So it was always about these are women first, ball players second. And so that has not changed as we go along. Now, at the same time, there were some who saw this as an opportunity, as a way to take advantage of the entertainment that was offered here, and a way to make money. So they saw it as part of the growth in the professionalization, the business side of things. And so you'll notice the gentleman in the back row of this picture with the very long whiskers, best known as Sylvester Wilson, though at times he appeared in the newspapers under a different moniker. But he's probably, certainly not alone, but probably one of the best representatives of those who saw this as a way to take advantage, to turn this into a business for themselves. And so what Sylvester Wilson and others like him tended to do was that they would advertise a women's baseball team. They would put together a team like you can see here, with the striped dresses. And so they probably would have been named for that. And then they would advertise them and take them into different cities, promising, of course, generally their families that they would be taken care of, that there was going to be no issues, because in many cases, as you can see by this picture, by their, in some cases, their age needed parental consent. So the idea that they were going to take care of them, but then what tended to happen was Wilson and others would up and leave, take the money, leave the team high and dry, and essentially run out of town and leave them to their own devices. Wilson often talked about in the papers sort of leaving a community just ahead of the police who were coming to arrest him. He was basically known for exploiting the teams and the girls more so than anybody who was truly promoting a good baseball team. And so think about this in addition to the newspaper coverage, in addition to the thought of society that says, this is a man's game. Women are not supposed to be participating. Oh, there are clergy, there are college faculty, others who are coming out saying, you know, women who get involved in this kind of physical activity are doing harm not only to themselves, but also to their childbearing abilities, which of course is what their role is supposed to be. So they're up against all of these things. And so when you think about the challenges, it's also then important to see how much women did and were able to participate, even faced with these kinds of challenges. Okay? And so here you have an interesting advertisement coming, the champion lady ball players of the world, right? From the 1890s, the Young Ladies Baseball Club, and they're going to play the Doylestown Baseball Club. And you can see 1890. And I realize it's probably a little small for you, but you can also then see the attire of the ladies, again, the striped dresses. And then notice, if you'll notice on the far side of it, it says the Young Ladies Athletic Club and Great Grecian Novelty Troupe. Okay. And so here is the women's baseball team being touted as the champion lady ball players of the world, but paired up as they travel with a novelty troupe. So that, again, even here, the focus more on the entertainment side, the vaudevillian kind of an approach to, but then it ends at the bottom, the only chance in a lifetime to see these champion lady ball players. So here we are in 1890 with this particular piece. And some of you might be saying to yourself, champions of what? And this also rather interesting, a 19th century phenomenon, not unique to women's ball playing, certainly, but it's called simply good advertising. We didn't necessarily relate to anything that could be quantified, right? But ask yourself, would you prefer to go see the lady ball players or the champion lady baseball players of the world, right? And so think about good marketing. And so again, this idea that that's going to help promote and bring more fans out to see them play. And so we're going to see this starting to become, by the 1890s, a fairly common thing that you will see in terms of promotion, which tells me that there's interest, but that the numbers may have grown. And so interesting kind of approach to think about in terms of this idea. And so here you have another 1890s team. This one, I think, gives us a little bit of a more interesting thing to think about. Again, similar attire, the striped dresses, the sashes that give their color. But in this picture, notice we know who the manager is. But more importantly, if you're able to see it, you can look at the bottom of this picture, and what do you notice? Something that was very rare. And here we have the names, first and last, of all of the ball players. So we've got, for example, Effie Earl at the shortstop. We know that May Howard is the captain and pitcher. And suddenly we've got names that we can look for to try to track down. And as it turns out, found a few articles with May Howard's name in them, playing for a couple different Reds and Blues teams, and blondes and brunettes. Nellie Williams, the catcher, her name appears. And so suddenly you've got the opportunity, rare as it is, to start to try to follow some of these ball players to figure out. And what it reveals to us is that some of these teams are traveling big distances. So they might be coming from New York out to Ohio, out to St. Louis, et cetera. And so you start to get a sense of the breadth by the 1890s with rare pictures that you find like this that give us a little bit to work with. Unfortunately, what we don't have are matching box scores, things like that, to be able to put together statistics on most of these women as to what they were doing, how they were hitting. That is much more rare, unfortunately. But here you have a prominent publication again of the 1890s, the National Police Gazette, which was used to promote all kinds of cultural activities, but particularly sporting activities, men for them generally. But this one, interesting, you'll notice the batter, pitcher male, so women playing against. But notice the caption at the bottom, it says, "Athletic girls play ball. Young women put up a good game on the grounds at Bayonne, New Jersey." And so here we are in the late 1890s with a national publication promoting the idea that these are athletic girls who are playing, that these are women who are to be taken seriously, that this game is a serious one. And so this is what I was talking about when I started, when we sort of see these two pictures of women's baseball. The sadly more common tended to be focusing on them as a novelty act, but here you have obviously a focus in the other direction, saying it's okay that these are women who are good at this game and they need to be taken seriously. It's a game worth going to see, right? That this is something that you want to take advantage of and get an opportunity to go see. Here's a team from 1896 in Pelham, New York, just outside of New York City, right? And notice again, we see this is just a local community team. But in 1896, there are 3 or 4 articles that appear in the Pelham newspapers talking about this women's baseball team, looking for opponents to play, looking for opportunities to play in and around the city, and asking for any who wanted to challenge them. And it's very clear from the few articles that you find that they are ideally looking for a women's team to play, but that they're going to take on any comers. And so they were not unwilling to play against men's teams. And what's interesting about this picture is talking about baseball team here in 1896, this is, by this picture, an all women's team, contrary to some of the bloomer teams that start to develop. So we're going to see they tended to have anywhere from 2 to 4 men on the team. So you might have 12 players, and 4 of them are gentlemen, or 5 of them. And typically, a lot of times, the men on the team were the pitcher and the catcher, because those were considered the most important positions, the thinking positions on the team, the ones that sort of controlled the game, and therefore the implication being that women really weren't capable of doing that, and so you had to have men jump onto these teams as well. But this is an interesting picture. And again, you'll notice the long skirts in most cases, but not as confined as we would have seen in the 1870s and early 1880s. In addition to all of the various teams that are starting to play, and by the 1890s, with the Reds and the Blues and things like that, I mean, we know, for example, that in and around the New York City, New Jersey area, by the 1890s, there are at least 11 or 12 women's baseball teams that have been identified playing. In New York State alone, Deborah Shattuck in her work has identified significant numbers of women's teams playing just in New York State alone between 1865 and 1900. But then there are also individuals like Elizabeth Stride, better known as Lizzie Arlington, as you can see here in the picture, who were individuals who played, who joined typically men's teams with the opportunity to put themselves out there. And so Lizzie Arlington, as she came to be known, was pitcher, and her 2 real claims to fame come in 1898, when she is playing on a men's team, the Philadelphia Reserves, who were playing against minor league baseball teams. And then later that summer, she finds herself pitching in a game for the Reddington minor league team, which is what makes her pretty unique in that respect, playing for men's professional team versus Allentown, and she will pitch in that game. It's the only time that we see her on a roster so far where she is pitching for a minor league baseball team, and it's considered the first time that we have identified that happening. But she is a good example. And again, even here though, you still see the same look. Her uniform obviously is going to obviously make her stand out. They're not having her wear the same uniform as the men, as they're promoting, as we're going to see, her as the star attraction. And here's a good example of that star attraction. So the Ladies Baseball Club, in this case, presenting Miss Lizzie Arlington, the famous lady pitcher. And so again, you see the marketing, the opportunity that some saw to take advantage of promoting this individual who was seen as the Bloomer Girls are en route on their 9th annual tour, traveling in their own special palace car. We get a little bit more detail from this piece, and they give you their records. And again, trying to back these up with box scores, things like that. Can't say we can do it, but these were the records reported in their advertising between 1892 and 1900. And so you can see they're playing anywhere from about 100, just over 110 games, up to their highest total in 1897 of nearly 200 games. And they don't, all they tell you in here is how many games they lost. So those of you with good math skills can see in most years they're right around 500, and in some they are significantly better than that. Who they are playing, this does not tell us, and that's a fairly typical unfortunate situation. But we also know now that this particular Bloomers Girl team that are traveling, they've been around for a while, so there's longevity here, which means you've got fans who are willing to come out and watch and pay. And then they've got their own palace car, they've got their own way to travel. And so that would have been another piece that would have been a very difficult aspect of women's baseball in the 19th century. Again, thinking about how do you get anywhere? How are you traveling? Women on their own are not supposed to be out doing these kinds of things. And so I also like the other piece at the bottom where it says truthfully advertised and honestly conducted, right? And that's a jab at people like Sylvester Wilson, who were clearly not doing this honestly, right? And so plenty of room for people to come and watch. And so Lizzie Arlington, a good example of some of the female ball players that we're starting to see as we're moving from the college teams, the reds and the blues, the blondes and the brunettes, into the bloomer girl teams, because it's the bloomer girl teams that are going to move us into the 20th century, that start really in the early 1890s and are going to become the significantly better ball players and far less seen as the vaudevillian kind of entertainment acts. And so Lizzie Arlington and others like her are going to be a part of that shift from less serious to, we start to realize there's opportunity here. As I've always said, baseball, though we tend to view it as a male game, women have been a part of it from the very beginning and have wanted to be a part of this particular game. And so when we think about the bloomer girls getting started in really the 1890s, as I say, probably one of the more well-known is Maud Nelson. You can see a picture of her there on the left-hand side of the screen, and one of the many teams she was a part of, the Western Bloomer Girls Baseball Club. And again, notice she is the champion lady pitcher of the world. And so that same kind of advertising that we're going to see. But here you can see the change in uniform. The bloomers have become the norm. Maud Nelson comes in as a player, manager, owner, has a career that lasts into the 1930s. And she's going to be involved with a number of bloomer teams, the New York Bloomers, the All-Star Bloomers, the Western Bloomers. And these teams are going to travel significantly. So the Western Bloomer Girls, the New York Bloomer Girls are going to find themselves traveling all across the country. And so playing again against whoever is willing to take on the challenge. In this one, you've got the Bloomer Girls versus the local club. That's all it says, right? So we don't know, but the key here is, once again, focusing on that notion of champion lady pitcher of the world. So we got Lizzie Arlington, got Maud Nelson, as two good examples of some of these really fascinating early women ball players. Some of you may have heard the name Lizzie Murphy. She comes a little bit later. Alta Weiss is just after the turn of the century. So we're really sticking to 19th century ball players here, but those are other good examples. We see Amanda Clement coming in as an umpire just after the turn of the century. We will start seeing women reporting on the game right in the late 1890s, but really more as we move into. So these are the women who are setting the stage for what is beginning to happen in the late 1890s and as we move into the 20th century. Because remember, one of the other things that sometimes people ask, the game of softball doesn't exist yet. It's invented right in the 1890s. And so it's a relatively new entity and has not yet been established as the women's game. That doesn't come till later, because in fact it was not invented with that thought in mind. And so that's not the alternative for women. And so 1890s is, and the early 20th century is why we see, I think, in part, such great growth in the opportunities for women to play. Okay. Here, just another example of one of those teams that's making the transition from the Reds and Blues into the Bloomers. And so they're not quite there yet. And there's always this emphasis on all these pictures, as you'll notice. And the articles say the same thing on the caps that they're wearing. And the importance of making sure that they are attired appropriately and representing well. And so this is one of the athletic stars, is who this team was. Here is another Bloomer Girls team from the late 1890s. And you can see that they have their own traveling car. And so it's being advertised. This is at the same time, just to show an example, 1890s in black baseball, Page Fence Giants are suddenly the team to beat, the team everybody is aware of, who are traveling in their own railroad car. and they're being able, and so they're using that as a way to not only make it easier for them to get places, but also to advertise not only their team, but who is sponsoring them in that case. But you can see that this is a Bloomer Girl team by their attire as well as they are starting. And so this would have been an example of those teams that are starting to be taken more seriously. And this is a team that played primarily out west. This is in Colorado, I believe, was where this picture was taken. And here are the Star Bloomer Girls. Another one of those, and this is right after the turn of the century, so because I can find a good picture of them earlier. And you'll notice what I was talking about as you look at this picture. If you look fourth person in and then towards them, you'll see the two gentlemen that are in the picture, which was, again, as I said, a fairly typical aspect of the Bloomer Girl teams, is seeing that opportunity. But you can see here how much more serious they, and we recognize them as ball players as opposed to some of those earlier pictures, simply again because of their attire, and the baseball caps had become more like the actual baseball caps, and so this is the kind of advertising you would have started to see much more of. Okay. Also want to mention and not ignore the fact that while we're talking about women's baseball in the 19th century, there are Black women's teams as well that we start to see by the 1880s. And what you'll notice here, that what I have a picture for you is a book cover. This is a book that came out in the last 2 years, the Dolly Vardens. And the Dolly Vardens are a professional Black women's baseball team playing in the city of Philadelphia in 1883. And at the time that they were playing, we been able to identify 2 Dolly Varden teams. And they were just simply known, again, this won't surprise you, as the Dolly Vardens 1 and the Dolly Vardens 2. And so no other distinction in their names. And they played one another in various spots throughout the city. There also happened to have been a third women's Black baseball team in Philadelphia in 1883 called the Captain Jinks. And we do have a couple of very small articles about them. What we have a lot more of on the Dolly Vardens, again, interesting that here it didn't matter whether we're talking about a Black women's baseball team, white women's baseball team, emphasis in the article on how they were attired. And so the artist here has been able to recreate their uniform, the bright red, the red caps, the whole thing, from the description in the article. And so if you get a copy of this book, the artistic renderings of what are beautiful to get a sense of, but that's what it comes from. It comes out of 2 or 3, and there's one really long article that talks about the Dolly Vardens, but gives a huge description of their uniforms, and then talks about them as being a novelty, essentially, that they were, again, not to be taken seriously, that this was a team, but they also identify a number of the ball players, at least by Miss and then their last names. A lot of, again, not a lot of first names, no box scores, any of that kind of thing. And that becomes the unfortunate difficulty in trying, and it shouldn't necessarily be a surprise to anybody listening, right? Again, thinking about just women playing sports, and especially playing baseball, white or Black in the 19th century, coverage is limited. You're not going to find lots of box scores. Occasionally you'll get line scores, but that's all it is. Much more common to simply have them identified by their last names or just their first names. I've also had articles that just identify them as, for example, the captain here as Miss Ella, and that's it. And you're like, okay, so you can see the difficulty in doing research in trying to track down who these ladies are and where they go in the future. And so one of the difficulties in trying to look at women in the 19th century. And then here is just a quick look at some of the sources that I was using in order to try to put all of this together. But as I say, when we're talking about women's baseball in the 19th century, I think the key thing to think about, the key thing to remember is that women were playing and that they were there and they were involved. And it is not a new phenomenon in the 1940s with the All-American League or today with all of women have participated in various ways. There have met some of the same challenges across the time frame, but certainly in the 19th century, much more emphasis on them as to try to put challenges in their way, right? Whether it was because they shouldn't be doing this physically, it was immoral in some people thought because good girls, right, women didn't do this kind of thing, and that was the vaudevillian kind of connection. And so to me, when you think about those kind of things, it makes it even more impressive to think about the roles and the number of women who were playing, who tried to get out there and have an opportunity to play this game, facing those kinds of challenges. Going back to, as an example, just to finish, when the some of the college women's teams played, sometimes the conditions under which they were allowed to play, for example, were that they couldn't play where they could be seen. So imagine your college campus buildings and you have to play behind the buildings so that nobody coming past, somebody coming to visit, would actually see you out there playing, right? And so it was only acceptable as long as nobody really knew, there was no record of. And then sometimes one of the women's teams, they were stopped and told they were no longer allowed to play if anything got broken. And they weren't necessarily talking about a woman breaking an arm or a leg. In one case, it was they broke a window with a ball they hit through it, and the team was disbanded at that point. And so, variety of different ways of looking at how some of the challenges they had. I read an article the other day about a women's team playing in somewhere in Indiana. It didn't exactly say the exact spot, but supposedly, according to this newspaper reporter, woman tripped over first base and broke her arm. But then it goes on to say, and she continued to play the game. And then the article ends, and you're like, okay. And so this is sometimes the kinds of coverage that you get. But it's a fascinating subject, and there's always more to learn. And so I'm going to conclude with that, and I'm happy to take any kinds of questions that anybody might have at all about it.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much, Leslie. We really appreciate it. I'm going to actually turn the screen because we don't have fancy technology here in the Skenes. I'm going to turn the screen so that you can actually see our audience. While you were presenting, we had a number of ball players come in for the game this afternoon. And I think it'll be a little more intimate if we're able to do that. So I'm going to flip the screen and open it up to questions.
Sounds good.
All right. All right. So I may just actually hold it because that might be a little bit easier. Can you see? Can you see everybody?
I can. Hey, everybody.
All right. All right. Good deal. So what questions do you have? Diane.
Marilyn or Colin, in your research, have you ever found that evidence of female baseball players in the Catskills?
I didn't catch that.
So I'll repeat the question.
Thank you.
Diane is our Middletown town historian, and she asked if in your research, if you've ever uncovered women in the 19th century playing ball in the Catskill region.
And the answer to that is yes. And I think partly because of the hotels there that you see some of this, but I have found articles for places like Kingston, which is just slightly outside, but I'm trying to think where else. I'm not sure if I found one from Middletown.
The town of Middletown will we'll make that.
Right. Yeah. I do have, I mean, I know in the early 20th century, there are bloomer teams playing in Middletown. Because I've seen a number of articles. They get more, you get more of those as you move into the early 20th century. But the most immediate one I can think of is Kingston for sure.
And yeah, so what other questions did we, and also I should mention that Mark Duran has joined us too. So he's in the house.
Hey, Mark.
For those on the recording in Zoom, Mark's been working diligently on wrapping up the production for a documentary on women in baseball called Her Game is Hardball, and I believe Leslie will be a feature of that as well.
Yes.
Yeah. Excellent.
Leslie, could I ask you, why do you think, since women were playing the game as much as men or more, going back to Victorian England, and then so much in the 1800s, why has this history so little known? Why is it so obscure? In your opinion, because trying to hook together America's pastime, women were playing this great game long before basketball and all these other sports, which they all have professional leagues. What do you think the reason for that?
Can you repeat that for me, Colin? Because I only
Sure,
caught.
yeah, I'll just synthesize here.
Thanks.
Why being that we had so much there other sports where women were playing prominently, but the baseball, women in baseball was kind of relatively obscure. Goes back much further than other sports. What's
Sure.
your thoughts on that?
Well, that's always the big question I think everybody has. And I don't know that there's a perfect answer, but in my opinion and my thought, as I have done the research, is I think it actually has to do with the history of baseball itself and the idea of what it represented in the 19th century. And part of that is because it is the oldest, right, of those team sports, football and basketball certainly, and others come later. And the idea that it was America's national pastime. It was very much associated with certain characteristics that were being promoted as important to America and what America represented. And I think in the 19th century, of course, that was a very male-dominated society. Everything was, in terms of who's in power, who's doing, right? It was all seen that way. And so I think baseball is seen as represent. I think that's also why baseball struggles in so many other areas in terms of minorities, things like that, participating as well. I think it's a very similar idea. It has to do, if you think about it, by the 1890s, right? You think about Spalding and some of the others who are going to use baseball to promote America, to go overseas on goodwill tours, right? And use baseball to promote an image of America that they wanted people to have. And so I think that is very much tied to, there's this whole culture of masculinity in the 19th century that is tied to particularly baseball, because again, it is that earlier sport when this was very much a part of how we were developing as this new American society, separating ourselves from the English, et cetera. So I think that has a lot to do with it.
Okay.
Could I follow up on that just quickly?
Sure. Yes, we have a follow-up.
So Tamara Holmes the other day.
You should probably come closer so she can actually hear it, because it's hard to articulate such a thoughtful question. So Mark is going to approach the mic.
Right.
So I've been working a bit now with Tamara Holmes, and she.
Can you hear him?
Tamara is one of the great stars of Team USA when it's baseball World Cup. And she spoke with two other veterans, and Malika Underwood and Maggie Meglander. And Malika said that she felt, as she's learning this history, that it's very important for them in terms of the present. That she feels that history needs to be understood much more as this struggle continues for women to try to play baseball, whether it's in high school or college, or possibly pros, or have a league of their own, or a mixed league, whatever, all of those.
Right.
That this history, she feels, is very important for kind of guiding the present and the future. And I just wonder if you might respond. I thought she put it very articulately.
Yeah, no, I would 100% agree with, I would 100% agree with Malika and the others. It's that reinforcement of, right, the sort of cliched saying, if you don't see it, you can't be it, right? And so if you don't know that this has a history, that there are people who came before you, it's very hard to see yourselves making that change, getting the support. It's important to be able to give people and say to people, you know, this is not new. There are those who came before us. There is this long history that's there that says we are capable, we have been involved, there is no reason to keep women out of this game, right? And that history helps show that. And unfortunately, they're not wrong, and it's not a history that most people know anything about. I mean, I would argue that until the movie A League of Their Own came out, right? And that didn't come out till 1992, the vast majority of people had no idea that women played baseball, right? And it was that movie that really brought attention. And then for a lot of people, that was as much as they knew. There was a league during World War II. But the history is so much bigger than that. And that history also shows that there are women who played, who owned teams, who umpired, who wrote about it. And I think all of that history is history that needs to be told.
Catherine, you had a follow-up?
A women's league during World War II, you just said that's
Mhm.
because most of the men were away fighting in the war, right?
Yeah. So the league, that was the whole idea behind the league when it was created, and was the idea that Philip Wrigley, owner of the Cubs, right, saw an opportunity to continue to promote baseball. And he originally had the idea that it was going to be a softball league. That was the original intent. But he was looking for something to replace the baseball that was being missed, because there were over 500 men who, between the minor leagues and the major leagues, who served in World War II. And so baseball was in danger of not being played. And so here was, so once again, what I find fascinating is to think about that. The only reason they got to play for the most part was because men's baseball was in decline. And the idea was, as soon as the war was over, it was supposed to end. And it does last till 54, so it lasts a little longer, but not a whole lot. And so the idea was, if you look at that, you realize, yeah, there was no permanent change here. It was simply because there was a need, and when that need disappeared, things were supposed to go back to the way they had been before.
I have a brief question from my son Brody, who was also in attendance at the East-West Classic. So Brody, shoot. So he said, how come the girls dressed differently than men back then in baseball?
Great question. That's a great question, Brody. And the answer is simply because that's what society expected. Women were supposed to be women, and they wore skirts all the time. And so it didn't matter what they were doing. They were expected to continue to wear their skirts, because that's what society expected of them. And so unfortunately, you can imagine what that was like, playing in a long skirt. Yeah. The only advantage was when you caught a ball on the bounce with the long skirt, you could smother the ball and it ain't going anywhere. Right. That was about the only time it worked as an advantage.
All right, I'll have a follow-up on the mention of softball. So softball, you mentioned, comes around in the 1890s, but when in the history does it start to mess it all up? Like what year or what generation does it become sort of the preeminent ball game for women?
Little League, 1930s.
I think Rob and I talked about this. So Rob Agrito's here from New York Girls Baseball, and he and I had a long conversation last fall about
it's Little League. Gotcha. Because Little League, when it is established, makes rules and says, you know, and then when they get challenged in the 70s, right around Title IX, right, to change that, that's when they decide, well, the answer to the court cases is we'll create softball under the Little League name, and therefore we've met, you know, and so it's Little League in great part that is responsible, and American Legion ball, but that's the same time as, but it's it's early 1930s when that really becomes solidified, and it's Little League in great part that is responsible for that.
Yeah, and I think this year is the 50th anniversary of girls, including being
Yes.
included in Little League baseball. So there's
Which is why they finally had the Maria Pepe
yeah,
Little League. Yeah.
Yeah.
But look how long it took them to do that.
I know. Yeah, we actually celebrated here with the Catskill Mountain Little League this year, and I did a duet with for the national anthem where I had one of our softball players with our one of our baseball players, and they came together. And yeah, since we created the softball division, even internally in the Catskill Mountain Little League, of course, now they're not coming to play baseball anymore. So I'm always, I always ask the kids, would you like me to pitch overhand or would you like me to pitch underhand? Because then it kind of gives me a chance to figure out, okay, like, do we have one that wants to play baseball instead? I want to always encourage that for all the kids. So
yeah,
that's great. Thank you for unpacking that.
Sure.
With the time we have about 3 minutes left, and then we all have to go put our unis on and get to set up the field and
The
start
fun part, get to go play.
That's right. Do we have any questions from the League of New York, New Jersey ball players? Catherine, you want another? Sure.
Imagine playing baseball in those, long skirts.
All right.
I didn't hear the first part of that.
She said she just can't imagine playing baseball in those long
No, I can't
skirts.
either.
Yeah.
Well, not only were they long, but early on, you'll notice in some of those pictures, I mean, they were still pretty tight laced, the whole deal.
Yeah.
And they were long sleeves. I mean, everything.
Yeah.
They must have been really hot.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
In 19th century, in the vintage baseball community, we know of a few teams out there. One particularly in the Ohio Village, historic village, there's a team called the Ohio Village Muffins, and they have a female team, and they actually do play in skirts, long dresses, and very period accurate. And then out in Arizona, there's a team that formed called the Maricopa Maidens. And although they're playing an 1860s game, they could not bear the thought of wearing long skirts and dresses in Arizona heat. So they actually adopted something closer to what you'd see in the American Girls Professional Baseball League. So they wear the short skirts and the high socks, and of course there's lots of commentary from the vintage baseball community on historical accuracy, but I just can't even imagine playing in looking like a master college kid.
Well, as long as they tell people that people will understand the reason, because I can't imagine anywhere out west, but particularly Arizona, Las Vegas, places like that, playing in those longs that actually could be dangerous.
Gotcha. All right. Well, my last two, I'll take the liberty since the organizer, and you mentioned Rockford, and of course the International Women's Baseball Center is going to be built in Rockford, Illinois. And there was an early article that you had that you mentioned Rockford. Was that Rockford, Illinois, I assume?
Yes, it was. Yep.
Okay. And so what you mentioned, there's a lot going on in the New York, New Jersey area around women's baseball, but Rockford seems to be this epicenter. Can you talk just a minute about that? And then lastly, and then we'll let you kind of drop the mic after this. You've had an incredible month, and this kind of goes a little bit beyond just the women's baseball touch, but you've been to the launch of the new Hall of Fame exhibit that you helped design. You've attended the East-West Classic and the recreation of the Negro League's All-Star Game at Doubleheader Field with all the former recently retired Major League ball players. You were just at Rickwood Field in Birmingham. Wow. What a month. And for all the work that you've put into all of that, I just wondered if you could close with just unpack that a bit for us as to what that means to you personally and all the work that you've done. And then we'll drop the mic. We'll let you drop the mic.
Sure. So the Rockford question first. I think Rockford's proximity to Chicago helped make it a place where certainly baseball just in general obviously has a long history in Rockford on the men's side, the Fall City and things like that. But women's baseball, not surprisingly, we find a number of teams playing in the late 1880s, early 1890s, from Rockford all the way through Chicago and up towards Milwaukee. So almost like another little corridor. And not surprisingly, then that same thing happens in World War II, because where's the league centered? It's again in Rockford, it's Milwaukee, it's all of that area. And I think it's its location more than anything else that makes it a perfect place. Hence the reason to put our museum there today. As far as what has happened over the last month or so with all of the things that have been going on for recognizing primarily the Negro Leagues, though at the East West Classic, of course, for those who weren't there, Monet Davis did play. And so her participation, that was pretty awesome to see. It's been gratifying and humbling. Humbling just from the standpoint of having had the opportunity to play even a small part in helping to make sure these stories are kept and told. But the most important part for me has been to see the recognition finally given to so many ball players, so many owners, so many family members who have never had anybody know their stories. And so to bring forward these stories in many cases, for the first time to so many people, it's long overdue, but so wonderful for all of them. And it's so important for us to get a fuller picture of what American history is all about, to be able to add these stories in and to know and to be able to celebrate them in ways that unfortunately many of them they never got to celebrate. And watching their families in many cases just be so joyful to see their names, their ancestors' names, right? In many cases, their fathers, their mother, getting this recognition is really, truly a beautiful thing to watch.
All right, well, fantastic. Thank you so much. Let's give her a round of applause.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy your game this afternoon. Sorry I can't be there to watch it.
Yes, we'll definitely play in the honor of the International Women's Baseball Center. And please go online and donate. There's a donate button prominently displayed just about on every page, I think. So with that, we will close. And thank you so much again, Dr. Leslie Heaphy.
Thanks. And thank you for asking me, Colin. Have fun this afternoon. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.